David Rodriguez had been dreaming of this day since he was 12 years old. Back then, he was just a kid from Arizona who spent his nights staring at the stars, wondering if anyone was looking back. Now, at 35, he stood inside the most incredible place any human had ever seen, a massive alien spaceship that sparkled like a diamond floating in space. The walls around him weren't made of metal or plastic like human ships. They looked like they were carved from pure crystal, but somehow they glowed with a soft blue light that seemed to come from within. Every surface was smooth and perfect, like someone had polished them for 1,000 years. The ceiling stretched so high above him that it disappeared into misty clouds that floated inside the ship itself. David had spent 3 whole years getting ready for this moment. He learned their language until he could speak it in his dreams. He studied their culture until he knew their customs better than his own. He practiced their greeting rituals 1,000 times in front of a mirror. Every single detail mattered because he wasn't just representing himself. He was representing every person who had ever lived on Earth. The pressure was enormous. Back home, billions of people were watching on their screens, holding their breath. Presidents and prime ministers had called him personally to wish him luck. Scientists had worked day and night to help him prepare. Children had sent him drawings of aliens and humans holding hands. All of humanity was counting on him to make a good first impression. As he walked through the crystal corridors, alien guards floated beside him. They didn't walk like humans. They seemed to glide through the air, their bodies shimmering with colors that changed like oil on water. Their faces were beautiful but strange, with large eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. They didn't speak to him, but he could feel them watching his every move. The throne room was beyond anything David had imagined. It was bigger than a football stadium, with pillars that twisted up toward the ceiling like frozen tornadoes. Strange plants with silver leaves grew from the walls, and creatures that looked like tiny flying jewels darted between them. The air itself seemed to hum with music, though David couldn't tell where it was coming from. At the center of it all sat Prince Zephyr, the heir to an empire that stretched across 100 star systems. The prince looked young, maybe 20 by human standards. But David knew that aliens aged differently. Those bright purple eyes had probably seen things that no human could imagine. His skin shifted through different shades of blue and silver, and when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of someone who had never known gravity. Prince Zephyr was surrounded by hundreds of other aliens, all dressed in flowing robes that seemed to be made of liquid starlight. Some had wings, others had extra arms, and a few looked almost human except for their glowing skin. They were all watching David with curious eyes, like he was some strange animal that had wandered into their palace. David felt his heart pounding as he approached the throne. Every step echoed in the vast space. He had practiced this moment so many times, but now that it was real, his mouth felt dry and his hands were shaking slightly. He reminded himself of all the people counting on him, all the hope that rested on his shoulders. When he reached the proper distance, exactly 30 steps from the throne, as their customs required, David stopped and performed the traditional greeting. He placed his right hand over his heart, bowed his head respectfully, and spoke in the prince's language with words he had memorized perfectly. "Great Prince of the Stars," David said, his voice carrying clearly in the crystal hall, "I come before you as a friend from the world called Earth. My people offer their hand in peace and their hearts in friendship. We hope to learn from your wisdom and share what little knowledge we have gained." For a moment, silence filled the enormous room. David kept his head bowed, waiting for the prince's response. He had been told that the prince might test him, might ask difficult questions, or might even ignore him completely. But he had never been prepared for what actually happened. Prince Zephyr's skin suddenly flashed a deep red color, a sign of anger that David recognized from his studies. When the prince spoke, his voice was cold and sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "So this is what crawls up from the mud planet," the prince said, his words dripping with disgust. "Look at it, everyone. This creature thinks it can stand in our presence and call itself our equal. Its people are so primitive they still fight wars over water and dirt. They poison their own air and kill their own kind for pieces of metal. and yet it dares to offer us friendship? The prince stood up from his throne, his tall form towering over David. Your species is a disease that spreads across planets, consuming everything in its path. You destroy beauty to build ugliness. You choose fear over love, hatred over understanding. What could such backward creatures possibly teach the children of the cosmos? You are nothing but cosmic accidents, mistakes that somehow learn to make noise. The words hit David like physical blows. Every syllable was chosen to hurt, to make him feel small and worthless round the room. Some of the alien nobles made sounds that might have been laughter. Others looked uncomfortable, as if even they thought the prince had gone too far. David felt his face burning with shame and anger. Part of him wanted to defend his people, to list all the beautiful things humans had created, all the progress they had made. Another part wanted to argue, to point out that the prince was being unfair and cruel. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. But then something else happened. In that moment of hurt and anger, David remembered something his grandmother had told him when he was little. She had said that the measure of a person wasn't how they acted when things were easy, but how they chose to respond when things were hard. He thought about all the people watching back on Earth. He thought about the children who had sent him drawings. He thought about the scientists who had worked so hard to make this meeting possible. Did they deserve to have their representative get into an argument with an alien prince? Did humanity's first impression with another species need to be one of anger and defensiveness? David slowly straightened up. He looked directly into Prince Zephyr's purple eyes, and for a moment, the two beings simply stared at each other. The entire throne room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then David did something that no one expected, something that would be remembered by both species for generations to come. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself or his people. He didn't get angry or beg for another chance. Instead, he simply turned around and began walking toward the exit. His footsteps echoed loudly in the crystal hall as he made his way across the vast floor. Every alien eye was on him, but he kept his head high and his pace steady. He didn't look back, didn't say a word, didn't show any sign of the pain he was feeling inside. Behind him, the throne room erupted in confused whispers and shocked gasps. No one had ever simply walked away from Prince Zephyr before. Species usually either begged for mercy or challenged him to combat, but this human had done neither. He had just left. As David reached the massive doors that led out of the throne room, he could hear the aliens behind him still talking in amazed voices. Some sounded angry, others confused, and a few almost seemed impressed. But David didn't turn around to see their faces. He had made his choice, and now he would live with the consequences. Whatever happened next, at least he had shown the universe that humans could face insults with dignity, that they didn't need anyone else's approval to know their own worth. The crystal doors closed behind him with a soft chime, leaving the alien court to wonder what kind of species they had just encountered. The video spread across Earth faster than wildfire. Within 2 hours of David walking away from the alien prince, every news channel was playing the footage on repeat. Social media exploded with reactions, debates, and theories about what would happen next. The crystal-clear recording showed everything, the prince's cruel words, David's steady breathing, and that powerful moment when he simply turned his back and walked away. In coffee shops and office buildings, people gathered around screens, arguing about whether David had done the right thing. Some called him a hero. They said he had shown the aliens that humans had dignity and wouldn't beg for scraps of respect. Others were furious, claiming he had thrown away humanity's best chance to join the galactic community. They worried that his pride had doomed the entire human race to isolation among the stars. The president held an emergency press conference that night, standing behind the podium with tired eyes and a grim expression. She tried to calm a panicked nation. David Rodriguez acted according to his best judgment in an impossible situation, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her. We are reviewing all options and remain committed to peaceful contact with our galactic neighbors. But behind closed doors, the situation was much more tense. Government officials were having heated meetings that lasted until dawn. military. Leaders wanted to prepare for the worst, while diplomats scrambled to find ways to fix what they saw as a disaster. Phone calls flew between world capitals as every nation tried to figure out what this meant for humanity's future. David himself was stuck in a small room on the space station orbiting Mars, officially suspended while investigators decided his fate. The room had one small window that looked out at the red planet below, and he spent hours staring at it, wondering if he had made the biggest mistake in human history. Guards stood outside his door, not to keep him safe, but to make sure he didn't. Talk to reporters who were desperately trying to reach him. His only visitor was Dr. Lisa Chen, a psychologist who had worked with him during his training. She was one of the few people who truly understood the pressure he had been under. When she sat across from him in that tiny room, she could see the weight of the world in his eyes. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly, her hands folded in her lap. David was quiet for a long time, watching Mars slowly rotate outside his window. "I keep thinking about my nephew," he finally said. "He's 8 years old, and he thinks I'm some kind of superhero because I got to meet real aliens. If I had stayed and begged that prince for another chance, what would that have taught him? That humans should accept being treated like dirt just to get what we want." Dr. Chen nodded, understanding the deeper struggle David was facing. She had spent months preparing him for this mission, but no amount of training could have readied him for such a personal attack on his entire species. Meanwhile, on the alien mothership, Prince Zephyr was discovering that his actions had consequences. Too, his father, Emperor Valerian, was ancient even by alien standards and had ruled their empire for thousands of years. The emperor had seen countless species rise and fall, but he had never encountered one that responded to insults by simply walking away. The throne room where David had been humiliated was now filled with the emperor's advisors, all chattering nervously about what the humans' response meant. Some thought it showed weakness, that humans were too cowardly to fight back when challenged. Others worried it might indicate a dangerous unpredictability that could make them hard to control. Emperor Valerian sat silently on his crystal throne, his skin shifting through deep shades of blue and purple as he processed what had happened. Finally, he spoke to his son in a voice that carried the authority of millennia. "In all my years of rule," the emperor said slowly, "I have seen species react to dominance in only two ways. They either submit completely, accepting their place as servants, or they lash out in futile anger, proving their primitive nature. But this human did neither." Prince Zephyr, still young and proud, defended his actions. "I was testing their resolve, father. If they cannot handle a simple challenge to their worth, how could they possibly be useful allies? And what did you learn from your test?" the emperor asked, his large eyes studying his son carefully. The prince hesitated. He had expected the human to either grovel for forgiveness or explode in rage. Either response would have confirmed what he had been taught about lesser species. But David's quiet dignity had left him confused and somehow unsettled. Back on Earth, the investigation into David's actions was revealing surprising things. The commission reviewing his decision discovered that he had actually anticipated the possibility of being insulted or rejected. In his private notes, written weeks before the mission, he had considered various scenarios and how humanity should respond to each one. One entry, dated just 3 days before his departure, read, "If they try to make us feel small, we must remember that our worth isn't determined by their opinion of us. Sometimes the strongest response to hatred is to refuse to engage with it at all." Dr. Alex Thompson, David's former training partner, testified before the commission about conversations they had shared during preparation. David always said that how we handled rejection would be more important than how we handled acceptance. He explained to the panel of serious-faced officials. He believed that begging for approval would set a precedent that could hurt humanity for generations. As the days passed, something unexpected began happening across Earth. The initial panic and anger started giving way to a different feeling: pride. Videos began appearing online of people recreating David's walk, turning their backs on bullies and walking away with dignity, students facing harassment at school, employees dealing with abusive bosses, and even entire communities standing up to those who tried to make them feel worthless. A movement began to form around David's action. People started using the phrase "taking the walk" to describe choosing dignity over desperate attempts to win approval from those who had already shown their disrespect. T-shirts appeared with David's silhouette walking away, accompanied by words like "dignity over desperation and worth isn't given, it's known." But the most surprising reaction came from an unexpected source. Deep space monitoring stations began picking up unusual activity from the alien mothership. Instead of preparing to leave Earth's solar system, as many had expected, the ship seemed to be staying in position. Strange energy readings suggested they were conducting some kind of research or analysis. What humanity didn't know was that Prince Zephyr had begun his own investigation. Using his people's advanced technology, he had been studying human history, culture, and behavior patterns. What he found challenged everything he thought he knew about primitive species. He discovered records of humans sacrificing their own lives to save strangers. He found art and music created purely for beauty, with no survival value. He read about humans choosing to forgive their enemies, to help those who had hurt them, and to keep trying even when all hope seemed lost. Most disturbing of all, he found evidence that humans had faced extinction-level events multiple times throughout their history, yet had always found ways to survive and grow stronger. They had overcome plagues, natural disasters, and their own destructive tendencies through cooperation and determination. Late at night, in his private chambers aboard the crystal ship, Prince Zephyr found himself watching the recording of David's exit over and over again. Each time, he noticed something new: the way David's breathing stayed steady despite the obvious pain, the straightness of his shoulders as he walked away, the complete absence of pleading or anger in his movements. For the first time in his young life, the prince began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. The human's response hadn't been what any of his teachers had predicted. It had been something entirely new, something that suggested depths to this species that no one had bothered to explore. As both worlds struggled to understand what would happen next, neither realized that David's simple walk across a crystal floor had set in motion events that would change both civilizations forever. Sometimes the smallest actions create the biggest waves, and the choice to maintain dignity in the face of cruelty had rippled out across the galaxy in ways no one could have imagined. 2 weeks after David's walk changed everything, Admiral Rebecca Torres sat in a windowless room deep inside Pentagon headquarters, staring at hundreds of documents spread across a massive table. As the head of Earth's First Contact Commission, she had the impossible job of figuring out whether David Rodriguez had saved humanity's dignity or destroyed their future among the stars. The commission had been working round the clock, interviewing everyone who had trained David, analyzing every second of the alien encounter, and trying to understand the psychology behind his decision. Rebecca had served in the military for 30 years, but she had never faced a puzzle quite like this one. "Show me the bathroom footage again," she said to her assistant, Technical Sergeant Williams, who was operating the holographic display system. The room filled with a three-dimensional replay of David in his private quarters just hours before the meeting. He was practicing his greeting in front of a mirror, but between repetitions, he would stop and stare at his own reflection with an expression that was hard to read. Computer. Enhance audio segment 4. 7. Rebecca ordered. The room filled with David's quiet voice as he spoke to himself in the mirror. "They might try to make you feel small," he whispered, adjusting his formal uniform. "Remember what Grandma Rosa always said, you can't control how others treat you, but you can control how you respond. Stay true to who you are, no matter what happens." Rebecca paused the playback and rubbed her tired eyes. She had watched this moment dozens of times, and each viewing revealed something new about David's mindset. He hadn't been naive about what might happen. He had actually prepared himself for the possibility of rejection or insult. Dr. Patricia Kim, the commission's chief psychologist, leaned forward in her chair. "This is the key evidence," she said, pointing at the frozen image of David in the mirror. "He made a conscious choice to prioritize dignity over diplomacy. The question is whether that choice was wise or foolish. The debate had been raging for days. General Harrison, representing the military perspective, argued that David had failed his mission by putting pride before practical results. Our job was to establish relations with a superior alien civilization, he insisted during heated discussions. Personal feelings should never override strategic objectives. But Dr. Kim disagreed. She had spent her career studying human behavior under extreme stress, and she saw something different in David's actions. He didn't act from wounded pride. She explained to the commission, his psychological profile shows someone who genuinely believed that how humanity responded to disrespect would set the tone for all future interactions. Rebecca had read David's personal files so many times she practically had them memorized. Born in a small town in New Mexico, raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident, academic scholarships to 3 different universities. Every teacher, every professor, every colleague described him the same way: thoughtful, principled, and surprisingly strong under pressure. The most revealing interview came from David's old college roommate, Tony Valdez, who had flown in from California to testify. Tony told the commission about a night during their sophomore year, when David had walked away from a fraternity party after some drunk students started making racist jokes. I asked him why he didn't stay and argue with them. Tony explained to the panel. David just shrugged and said, "Some battles aren't about winning or losing. Sometimes they're about showing yourself and everyone watching what kind of person you choose to be." That was just who he was. He'd rather walk away with his principles intact than compromise them for social acceptance. Meanwhile, millions of miles away on the alien mothership, Prince Zephyr was conducting his own investigation into the mysterious human who had dared to turn his back on royalty. The prince's private study was filled with holographic displays showing Earth's history, culture, and countless examples of human behavior that contradicted everything he had been taught about primitive species. He had been studying for days, barely eating or sleeping, driven by a growing sense that he had made a terrible error in judgment. His tutors had taught him that lesser species always responded to dominance with either submission or aggression. But David's response had been something entirely different, a kind of quiet strength that the prince had never encountered before. Show me more examples of human artistic expression, he commanded his personal AI system. The room filled with images of paintings, sculptures, music, and poetry created throughout human history. Much of it served no survival purpose, existing purely because humans found beauty valuable for its own sake. The prince paused at a holographic display of a human painting, a simple image of sunlight filtering through trees. According to the database, the artist had created it while living in poverty, selling it for barely enough money to buy food. Yet the painting radiated a kind of peaceful joy that made the prince's chest feel tight. With an emotion he couldn't name, his most trusted advisor, an ancient being called Keeper Nix, materialized in the study using the ship's transportation system. Nix had served the royal family for over 1,000 years and had witnessed the rise and fall of dozens of civilizations. "You have been studying the humans for many cycles," Nix observed, her voice carrying the wisdom of ages. "What have you discovered?" Prince Zephyr gestured at the displays surrounding them. "Everything I was taught about them appears to be wrong," he admitted, his skin shifting to colors that indicated confusion and distress. "Look at this. They create beauty with no purpose other than beauty itself. They sacrifice their own safety to protect strangers. They choose forgiveness over revenge, cooperation over competition." Nix moved closer to examine the human artworks. "And this troubles you because if they are capable of such complexity, such unexpected nobility, then my behavior in the throne room was not a test of their character. It was a revelation of my own ignorance," the prince said quietly. The investigation had revealed something that shook the prince to his core. Humans didn't just survive and reproduce like most species. They questioned their own existence, created meaning where none existed naturally, and regularly chose difficult moral paths over easy practical ones. They were, in many ways, more sophisticated than his own people in areas that had nothing to do with technology or military power. Back on Earth, Rebecca Torres was reaching her own conclusions. The commission had interviewed hundreds of people, analyzed thousands of documents, and consulted with experts in psychology, sociology, and interspecies relations. The evidence painted a clear picture of David's motivations and character. Ladies and gentlemen, Rebecca announced to the full commission during their final meeting. After extensive investigation, I believe David Rodriguez acted exactly as we should have hoped any human representative would act when faced with unprovoked hostility. She stood and activated the main display, showing David's psychological evaluation scores. This man scored in the 99th percentile for emotional intelligence, moral reasoning, and pressure resistance. He didn't walk away because he was angry or hurt. He walked away because he understood something the rest of us missed, which was, asked General Harrison, still skeptical, that begging for acceptance from someone who has already shown contempt would establish humanity as a species, willing to tolerate abuse in exchange for scraps of approval. David's walk wasn't about pride, it was about setting boundaries. He showed them that humans have standards for how we expect to be treated. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Rebecca was right, then David hadn't failed his mission at all. He had succeeded in ways they were only beginning to understand. Dr. Kim nodded slowly. The psychological literature supports this interpretation. When faced with bullying behavior, the healthiest response is often to refuse engagement rather than to fight or submit. David demonstrated that humanity possesses the emotional maturity to choose dignity over desperation as the commission prepared to release its findings. None of them knew that their investigation had been paralleled by another on the alien ship. Two species, separated by vast distances and completely different ways of thinking, had both reached the same conclusion, that a simple walk across a crystal floor had revealed depths of character that no one had expected to find. The real question now was what both sides would do with this new understanding. 3 months had passed since David walked away from the alien prince, and the world had started to move on. The initial panic had faded into resignation. Politicians spoke about focusing on Earth's problems instead of chasing impossible dreams. Among the stars, scientists returned to their Earth-bound projects, and children stopped drawing pictures of humans and aliens holding hands. But David Rodriguez couldn't move on. He sat in his small apartment in Houston, staring at the rejection letter from the space agency that had arrived that morning. After the commission cleared him of wrongdoing, he had applied to return to active duty, hoping to rebuild his career. The letter was polite but final. His services were no longer needed. The words liability to future diplomatic efforts hit him like a punch to the stomach. His sister Maria had been calling every day, begging him to come stay with her family in Colorado. You can start over, she kept saying. Get a normal job, meet someone nice, have kids. Forget about aliens and spaceships. But David couldn't forget. The memory of Prince Zephyr's cruel words and his own silent response played in his mind every night. What haunted him most wasn't the insult itself, but the missed opportunity. Somewhere out there, an entire civilization existed with knowledge and wisdom that could help humanity solve its greatest problems: climate change, poverty, disease. The aliens probably had solutions to all of it, and because of one arrogant young prince, that door had been slammed shut. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening while David was watching the news. The reporter was talking about the latest climate disaster, massive floods in Bangladesh, that had displaced millions of people. As the camera showed families wading through contaminated water, carrying their few remaining possessions, David felt something snap inside him. He turned off the television and sat in darkness for a long time. Then, moving with sudden purpose, he went to his computer and began typing. Not a letter to the government or a message to the media, but a simple transmission that he would send directly to the alien mothership, which was still floating silently in space beyond Mars. My name is David Rodriguez, he typed, 3 months ago. I walked away from your prince because I believed that dignity was more important than diplomacy. I still believe that. But I also believe that two civilizations should not remain strangers because of one bad conversation. I am coming back, not as Earth's representative, but as one person who thinks we can do better. David knew what he was. Planning was illegal. Unauthorized contact with alien vessels was now a federal crime, punishable by life in prison. But as he looked at the pictures on his desk, his nephew's school photo, his grandmother's wedding picture, his parents smiling on their last vacation, he realized that some things were worth the risk. The next morning, David drove to a small airfield outside the city where his friend Jake kept an old spacecraft used for asteroid mining. Jake owed David a favor from their college days, and after 3 hours of argument and bottles of beer, he agreed to help. "You're completely insane," Jake said as they prepared the ship for launch. "They'll throw you in prison for the rest of your life if the aliens don't kill you first." "Maybe," David replied, running through the pre-flight checklist. "But what if they don't? What if there's still a chance to fix this?" The small mining ship wasn't designed for long-distance travel, but it could reach the alien mothership in about 6 hours. As David strapped himself into the pilot's seat, he felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, he was taking action instead of just waiting for someone else to decide his fate. The journey through space gave him time to think about what he would say. He couldn't apologize for walking away. That would undermine the very principle he had stood for. But he could try to explain why he had come back, why he believed their species deserved another chance. When the alien mothership appeared on his radar, David's heart started beating faster. The crystal vessel was even more beautiful than he remembered. Floating like a jewel against the star field, it was also heavily armed, with weapon systems that could vaporize his tiny ship. In seconds, David activated his communication system and broadcast on all frequencies. "This is David Rodriguez requesting permission to speak with Prince Zephyr. I come alone and unarmed, seeking only conversation." For 10 minutes, there was no response. David began to wonder if they would simply ignore him or blow him out of space. Then a familiar voice filled his ship's speakers. Not the prince, but Emperor Valerian himself. Human David Rodriguez, the Emperor's voice carried harmonics that made it sound like music. "You have violated your species' laws to return here." Why? David took a deep breath. "Because walking away was about preserving dignity, Your Majesty. Coming back is about preserving hope. Not hope for my species to gain something from yours, but hope that understanding is possible between different forms of life." There was another long pause. Then, to David's amazement, the Emperor spoke again. "You will be brought aboard. My son has requested this meeting personally." As David's ship was gently captured by alien technology and drawn into the mothership's docking bay, he felt his hands shaking. This was either the bravest thing he had ever done or the most foolish, probably both. The docking bay was different this time, smaller, more intimate. Instead of the grand ceremonial halls, David found himself in what looked like a private meeting room. The walls were still crystal, but they glowed with warm, peaceful colors. Comfortable-looking furniture that seemed to be grown rather than built was arranged around a low table. Prince Zephyr was waiting for him, but the arrogant young royal from 3 months ago seemed like a different person. His skin shifted through gentle blues and greens instead of the harsh reds of anger. His posture was relaxed rather than dominating, and his large eyes held something that looked almost like nervousness. "You came back," the prince said simply. "I had to," David replied, "not because I needed your approval, but because I thought we both deserved a chance to try again." They sat across from each other in the soft crystal chairs, two beings from different worlds trying to bridge an impossible gap. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Prince Zephyr surprised David completely. "I have been studying your species for these past months," the prince said quietly. "I believe I owe you an apology." David blinked in surprise. "You don't owe me anything, Your Highness, but I appreciate you saying that." "No, I do owe you something," the prince insisted. "I owe you the respect I should have shown the first time. I judged your entire species based on incomplete information and my own prejudices. Your response taught me that there are forms of strength I had never encountered before." The conversation that followed lasted for hours. They talked about their childhoods, their fears, their hopes for the future. David learned that Prince Zephyr was actually younger than he appeared, still struggling with the weight of inheriting an empire spanning hundreds of worlds. The prince learned that David had grown up without parents, raised by a grandmother who taught him that true strength came from knowing when not to fight. As the hours passed, something remarkable happened. Two individuals from different species, different cultures, different ways of thinking, began to understand each other not as representatives of their civilizations, but as people trying to do their best in a complicated universe. When their meeting finally ended, both David and Prince Zephyr knew that everything had changed, not just for them, but for the future of both their worlds. The 7-hour conversation between David and Prince Zephyr changed both of them forever. When it ended, the prince sat alone in his chambers for a long time, staring at his reflection in the crystal walls. For the first time in his life, he understood what his father meant when he talked about the weight of wisdom. David spent the night in guest quarters aboard the alien ship, sleeping better than he had in months. When he woke up, he found a message waiting for him. Emperor Valerian wanted to see him immediately, as guards escorted him through the crystal corridors. David wondered if his unauthorized visit was about to end very badly. The Emperor's private study was nothing like the Grand Throne Room, where David had first been insulted. It was smaller, filled with books and artifacts from 1,000 different worlds. Emperor Valerian sat behind a simple desk, looking more like a scholar than a ruler of star systems. "Sit, young human," the Emperor said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "My son has shared with me the recording of your conversation. It was illuminating." David sat down carefully, still not sure if he was in trouble. "I didn't mean to cause any problems, Your Majesty. I just thought we deserved another chance to understand each other." Emperor Valerian studied David with ancient eyes that had seen the rise and fall of entire civilizations. "Tell me something, David Rodriguez. When my son insulted your species 3 months ago, why didn't you defend them? Why didn't you list their achievements or argue their worth?" David thought for a moment before answering. "Because their worth isn't something that needs to be proven to anyone else, sir. If I had stood there listing human accomplishments like a salesman trying to make a deal, it would have suggested that we needed your approval to feel good about ourselves. We don't." The Emperor's skin shifted to colors that David had learned indicated deep thought. "And yet you came back. Why risk everything for a second chance with beings whose approval you claim not to need?" "Because not needing your approval doesn't mean not wanting to know you," David replied. "My grandmother used to say that the best friendships aren't born from need, but from curiosity about what we might learn from each other." Emperor Valerian leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since David had met him, the ancient ruler smiled. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. I think I would have enjoyed meeting her." What happened next shocked David completely. The Emperor stood up and walked to a large window that showed the vast expanse of space beyond the ship. "I have decided to do something unprecedented in the history of our empire," he announced. "I am going to invite you to address our full council, not as a representative seeking favor, but as an equal sharing perspective." David's mouth fell open. "Your Majesty, I'm not a diplomat. I'm just one person who thinks our species should try to get along." "Exactly," the Emperor replied. "Our council has heard from thousands of species over the centuries. They have all come to us as either conquered subjects or ambitious petitioners. None have ever come simply as a friend seeking friendship." The next day, David found himself standing before the Galactic Council of the Zephyrian Empire, hundreds of beings from dozens of different worlds, all gathered in a chamber so vast it seemed to have its own weather system. He wore his simple, human clothes, looking small and ordinary among the elaborate robes and exotic appearances of the council members. But instead of feeling intimidated, David felt strangely calm. He wasn't here to beg or bargain. He was here to share something that felt more precious than any trade agreement or military alliance, the simple idea that different forms of life could choose to understand each other. "Honored members of the council," David began, his voice carrying clearly in the enormous space. "I come before you not to ask for anything, but to offer something. I offer you the story of a species that has made every mistake you can imagine, and somehow learned to do better." He told them about human wars that had ended not through victory, but through exhaustion and the mutual decision to try peace instead. He spoke about scientists who had shared their discoveries freely, even with former enemies, because they believed knowledge belonged to everyone. He described artists who had created beauty in the darkest times simply because they believed beauty mattered. "We are not asking to join your empire," David continued, looking directly at individual council members as he spoke. "We are not seeking protection or technology or territory. We are offering something different, partnership between equals, who believe that the universe is more interesting when different kinds of minds work together." But then David did something that no one expected. Instead of ending with grand promises or impressive statistics, he began talking about humanity's failures. He spoke honestly about pollution, warfare, and the countless times humans had chosen the easy path over the right one. "The measure of any civilization," David said, his voice growing stronger, "isn't in never making mistakes, it's in having the courage to admit when you're wrong and the wisdom to change course. We offer you our friendship not because we're perfect, but because we're still learning how to be better." The council chamber fell completely silent. For several minutes, no one moved or spoke. Then, slowly, one council member began a gesture that David didn't recognize, but he could feel that it was positive. Another joined in, then another, until the entire chamber was filled with aliens showing approval in dozens of different ways. The final vote wasn't even close. The Zephyrian Empire would establish formal diplomatic relations with Earth, not as rulers to subjects, but as equals exploring the galaxy together. Prince Zephyr, watching from his place of honor beside his father's throne, felt something he had never experienced before: genuine pride in his people's choice. The human who had walked away from his insults had taught him that true strength sometimes meant admitting you were wrong. Years later, when Prince Zephyr became Emperor Zephyr, he would establish the Galactic Cooperation Protocols, a new way for civilizations to interact based on mutual respect rather than dominance hierarchies. The protocols would eventually include over 50 different species, all working together to explore the mysteries of the universe. David returned to Earth as more than a hero. He came back as the architect of humanity's place among the stars, not as junior partners or conquered subjects, but as equals in the great adventure of consciousness exploring itself through countless different perspectives. The news of the successful second contact spread across Earth even faster than the first failure had, but this time the reactions were pure celebration. Children drew new pictures of humans and aliens working together. Scientists began preparing for exchanges of knowledge that would advance both civilizations. World leaders started planning for a future where humanity was part of something larger than just one small planet. David's nephew, now old enough to understand what his uncle had accomplished, asked him the question that everyone wanted answered. "Uncle David, how did you know that walking away would work out?" David smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "I didn't know it would work out, kiddo, but I knew that staying true to who we are was more important than getting what we wanted. Sometimes the best way to earn respect is to show that you don't need it to know your own worth." The moment David had walked away without a word had become the first step toward a new kind of relationship between civilizations. It proved that sometimes the strongest response to hatred isn't anger or submission, but the quiet dignity of knowing exactly who you are and refusing to compromise that for anyone's approval. In the end, that simple walk across a crystal floor had taught to entire civilizations something profound about the nature of true strength, real friendship, and the courage it takes to choose understanding over conflict. And it all started with one person's decision to value dignity over desperation, principle over politics, and hope over fear.